Hi, macro students. Miss Griffith here, going over 5.6 economic growth. You've seen all these concepts before. We are simply putting them together. All right, let's talk about how economists measure economic growth and standard of living. Well, they're not going to want to use nominal GDP because nominal GDP does not account for inflation. And we're actually not going to use real GDP either because it doesn't account for the size of the country in population. So what we really want to use is real GDP per capita because this does account for the country's population. This is simply the real GDP divided by the population. And the growth rate then is the change in real GDP per capita over time. Well, let's take a look at some of the characteristics of countries with high growth rates. What makes them have a high growth rate? First, let's look at this picture. You've probably seen something like this before, but here is a picture of North Korea, South Korea, and surrounding countries at night. Well, it's interesting because North Korea actually looks like part of the Sea of Japan, even though it is a country, right? Versus, look how bright South Korea is. Well, let's look at the difference in their GDP. North Korea's GDP is only 13 billion, where South Korea's GDP is 1.6 trillion. So a big difference there. Let's see why that might be. Well, countries that have more growth usually have the following characteristics. They have a good economic system. So if they are possibly promoting capitalism, well, capitalism promotes creativity, innovation, incentives to improve productivity. Notice we have productivity here. Okay, rule of law will also help. So if their country has political stability, these countries have a history of having more economic growth. And then number 3, I've started because you'll keep seeing this in the lecture, capital stock. When countries invest in capital stock, so machines and tools to make them more productive, they are going to grow more. So notice this word again, productive. Example 1, India has a relatively low GDP because they have a lot of labor, but they don't have very much capital. Versus Japan. Japan has few natural resources, but they have a high GDP. Why? Because of capital stock. And then, of course, we have human capital. All right, so we can think of that as knowledge. Countries that have a better education and training are more, okay, here's the word again, productive. And then number 5, this isn't always the case, but in general, countries that have access to more natural resources are more productive. So essentially, economic growth all boils down to productivity. This is the output per unit of input. All right, you've never seen this graph yet, but it's nice to show you productivity. This is called the aggregate production function. On the x-axis, we have physical capital per worker, and on the y-axis, we have real GDP per worker. This graph shows that an increase, okay, in the amount of inputs is going to cause an increase in the output, but not as a constant rate. Notice here, when we go from 0 physical capital to physical capital 1, that's giving us a lot more GDP, all right? Well, let's keep increasing the physical capital to physical capital 2. Well, it first grew here from 0 to physical capital 1. Now it's growing more, but not as much. And then if we increase physical capital 2 to physical capital 3, well, what happens to the GDP growth there? Well, it's growing, but still not as much. Well, why is this happening? Why do when we add more physical capital, why is the GDP decreasing? Well, this is due to diminishing returns, okay? You cannot just keep adding more and more physical capital and thinking that you're going to be more productive. I like to think of this as a pizza parlor. Say you own a pizza parlor and you have one person working in the pizza parlor. Well, that's going to be pretty difficult for that person because they're going to have to ring up customers, they're going to have to make the pizza, they're going to have to clean. Well, let's add another person. Okay, well, this is actually going to be more productive, right? You're going to be able to increase more per worker because now we can have specialization. Maybe one person is in charge of handling the customers while the other person is going to cook. Well, let's add a third person and we're going to become even more productive. But at a certain point, we are actually going to start becoming less productive per worker. Think about this as too many cooks in the kitchen. All right, if I had 15 cooks in the pizza parlor, well, people would now be getting in each other's way and they would not be as productive. All right. Okay, so now let's look here. All right, well, what happens if we have an improvement in technology? Well, an improvement in technology allows us to be more productive. All right, here's the productivity curve from 2019. And now let's say we had an increase in technology, and this is what our productivity curve for 2029 might look like. Well, now at the same amount of physical capital, all right, we are able to produce more GDP per worker due to this technology, okay? There we go. All right, let's take a look at our aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph next to our PPC graph to see what happens in the long run. Okay, so if investment increases, what happens in the short run and the long run? Well, in the short run, if investment increases, the first thing that's going to happen is aggregate demand increases, okay? It's a little hard to see with all of these curves here. I'm just going to draw it up here for a second. Okay, so say we have our long run aggregate supply here, and we have short run aggregate supply, and we have our aggregate demand. Well, when investment increases in the short run, what's going to happen? Well, aggregate demand increases. Well, what happened to the price level there? It went from right here to here. The price level went up, and it looks like we are operating, I'll do this as QY, I'll do this as Q1. It looks like we are operating in an inflationary gap. Well, normally what would happen is aggregate supply would decrease. It would shift to the left as wages increased due to this inflationary gap, and we would be back here at this long run aggregate supply. But because this original shift of aggregate demand was because of investment, we are able to now produce more output, and so our aggregate supply is actually going to increase. So this is what's happening in the long run. Now we are going to be operating at a new long run aggregate supply. So our long run aggregate supply shifted to the right due to investment, okay? So very important, that initial shift in aggregate demand needed to be investment in order for our long run aggregate supply to eventually shift to the right. Okay, so again, our long run aggregate supply can only shift when we have a means of producing more stuff, aka more investment spending here. All right, so now if this happened here where our long run aggregate supply shifted to the right, well, what's happening on our PPC or our production possibility curve? Well, it's going to shift outward. All right, normally we're only able to operate at these points along this curve, but now we can operate here. These points were once impossible are now possible due to capital stock. All right, note that the long run aggregate supply does not shift to the right with government spending or consumer spending, or when, I should say, when government or consumer spending increases, it's only when investment increases. And that's what our next slide also tells us. All right. So an increase in consumption or consumer spending or net exports or government spending, that does not cause economic growth. That does not cause our long run aggregate supply to shift to the right. Only investment is going to cause this growth because firms can now increase their physical capital, meaning they can be more productive. There are 3 multiple choice questions for you to go through. And then what I want you to do before, there are the answers, but before looking at the answers, I want you on your own piece of paper to try free response question number 3 from 2012. Do your best, and then you can look at the answers. And I've also posted Clifford's video walking you through this FRQ. At the top of your FRQ, I want you to write what grade you would have gotten if you were taking this on the AP test. And then simply submit this as a picture if you're doing it on paper, or a screenshot if you're doing it in Notability. Thank you and have a good day.